As per usual, all the links and a longer transcript will be posted at Rumble, not YouTube, because YouTube sucks. So we got Sam Seder. He's winging his Vienna sausage fingers. Black people are dying in New York City. We're all worried about it. We're gonna have an autistic fit. But don't mind the thousands of black people that were murdered by other black people in the inner city. Nothing to see here. Oh, look, a squirrel. So the bipolar Sam Seder and the uneducated bartender are suddenly worried about young black men, and the obese Joy Reid too she's all hot and bothered about black men dying at a young age. So I'm not going to read all this off, but basically I did an analysis of New York counties and who they voted for, the ones that were uber Biden and Hillary versus the ones that were uber Clinton and Biden versus the Trump counties, really pro-Trump counties. And surprisingly, I know you'll be shocked. Of course, there's not a whole lot of really pro-Trump counties in New York State. Voted for him 60% or more, but they had a much lower homicide rate. And the very pro-Biden and Hillary counties had a homicide rate not quite the national average, but getting close. But it was a lot higher than the New York average. So, again, I must say the most violent areas in New York State are not uber white, uber Republican areas, but the areas where Democrats dominate. I've covered data like that in state after state after state after state, and it is the same story whether the state is uber Republican or uber Democrat. Now to New York City. In New York City, blacks commit over 3/4 of all shootings. Ding! They are only 25% of the city's population. Whites, by contrast, commit only 2% of all shootings. This is from Heather McDonald. Though they are 34% of the population, New York's crimes disparities are repeated in virtually every racially diverse city in America, which we'll get to another one later real quickly. I have documented this over and over as well. Not as much as Heather McDonald, but I'm getting close. The real problem facing inner city black neighborhoods today is not the police, but criminals. In 2014, over 6,000 blacks were murdered, more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined. Who is killing them? Not the police and not white civilians, but other blacks. And blacks kill blacks at a much higher rate than whites kill whites, and Hispanics kill Hispanics. And Asians, they hardly register. And I'm Asian, so I'm better than you. Sorry. In fact, a police officer is more than 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer. If the police ended all use of lethal force tomorrow, it would have a negligible effect on the black homicide rate. In Chicago, this is still Heather McDonald here talking. In Chicago, in just the first 6 months of 2016, over 2,300 people were shot. That is a shooting per hour some weekends. The vast majority of the victims were black. During this same period, the Chicago police shot 12 people, all armed and dangerous. That is 0.5% of all shootings. We better do something about it. We're worried about black people getting killed. Well, here's some other data for you. Of the 75,560 adult arrests in New York City, 2016 to 2018, some of you may remember this, I've done this before. Of the 75,560 adult arrests in New York City, 2016 to 2018, categorized as violent, 54.84% of the arrestees were black. Of the 68,760 adult arrests in New York City, 2019 to 2020, categorized as violent, 54.98% of the arrestees were black. New York City, at that time, roughly 24% black. Now let's look at data across the entire state of New York. Of the 115,916 adult arrests in New York State, 2016 to 2018, categorized as violent, 50.7% of the arrestees were black. Of the 103,622 adult arrests in New York State, 2019 to 2021, categorized as violent, 51.56% of the arrestees were black. New York State is roughly 17.6% black. Democrats like the overweight Joy Reid and the uneducated bartender AOC also cried some crocodile tears over black men getting removed from the gene pool at such a young age. Speaking of that, I looked at the Homicide NYC website, and in 2022 and so far in 2023, there have been 40 children murdered in New York City. Get off your fat ass, Go buy some flowers and cry some crocodile tears for those kids. Keep in mind, New York City is much safer today than it was when Rudy Giuliani became mayor and the decades preceding his ascension to City Hall. 40 kids murdered in a city that large is not an eye-popping amount. If you want your eyes to explode, look at St. Louis City, another diverse dunghole run by Democrats in an uber-Republican state. New York City's uber-Democrat in an uber-Democrat state. St. Louis is an uber-Democrat city in a Republican-leaning state. People are fleeing New York City now. People have been fleeing St. Louis City for 50 years. According to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Now, if you're worried about black kids, here you go. This is where you can have an autistic fit over this, Stan. Take your Risperdal. Let's go. According to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, there were 66 children murdered in St. Louis, a city notorious for stratospheric amounts of murders, and most of it is black on black. 11 children, that was the 66 children were murdered in 2022 and 2021. 11 children have been murdered so far in St. Louis this year. Now listen to this. St. Louis only has 293,310 people according to the Census Bureau, and 55,728 of them are under 18 years of age. That means last year in St. Louis, the murder victimization rate for children was 66.393 per 100,000. 37 children murdered in St. Louis last year. I would guarantee 80 to 90% of them are black. So, if you're scared of young black males in St. Louis, or just young black people in St. Louis, and you're, oh, the police. If you find a young black male dead in St. Louis, which has a very high child murder rate, there's a very good chance it was another black person that did it. Not the police, not some redneck waving a Confederate flag. Now to some FBI Nibbers data, which I've covered before. Of the 16,977 homicide offenders, 8,504 of them were black, which is 50.09% of the total. Blacks are only 13.6% of the population. If I exclude situations where law enforcement did not know the race of the offender, blacks were 56.81% of all offenders. All murder offenders. Blacks were 38.83% of all assault offenders in 2021. And if I include only those where the race of the offender was known, blacks were 41.09% of all assault offenders. If one downloads the file for victims, of the 16,138 murder victims where we know the race of the victim, 9,114 of them, or 56.47%, were black. I've covered this before. How many times, Joy Reid, you fat, water-retaining sea cow? How many times do we have to go there? More than you go to the buffet or not? Huh? We're getting close. The most common theme among those murdered in these United States is the victim tends to be 35 years old or younger and black. Blacks are more than half of all offenders. You do the math, Sam Seder, if you can, fat boy. Keep in mind, pertaining to those FBI files on race, white includes Hispanic. I've also showed you how to download these. It's not real hard. I dumbed it down even for the Democrats. Think about that for a second. More blacks were murdered in 2021 than all other races combined, and most of the time, as I've documented, it's a black person killing them. In other words, the most common form of murder in America is a black person killing another black person. Again, if Joy Reid and Stan Seder are crying crocodile tears over young black men dying, I have a list 14 miles high that they can have faux autistic fits over for the next few decades. This does not mean that Jordan Neely was guilty or innocent. This is just the big picture. But as you will see, Neely was a thug who picked on old people and children. If he was hypothetically in rural western Iowa and tried to pick on a farmer who throws his weight in hay bales many a hot summer afternoon, well, he wouldn't pick that fight because Jordan Neely only assaults old people and children. When you pick a fight with a Marine and you harass people, it's very uncouth to get in people's faces and yell at them because sooner or later somebody's going to do something about it. They don't want spittle flying in their face. They don't want to smell your stinking breath either. I am so glad I do not live in New York City or some other Democrat-run hellhole that is descending into the 10th level of hell. I thank Jesus Christ for that every single day. I'm glad I do not have to ride the subway. A mentally ill, deranged person on a crowded subway car is a dangerous environment. If someone like Neely tried that in western rural Iowa, his intended victim would likely be armed, because most of us own our own property, and would retreat because they have plenty of area to retreat to. We don't live in small apartments, so we can retreat if needed. His intended victim would likely be armed and would retreat as much as they could as they called the police, but if the mentally ill person continues to pursue their intended victim, they would likely be met with lethal force, and this is what Neely found out that day. Although his demise did not come at the end of a person practicing constitutional carry, it came at the end of a forearm, not a firearm. I should also throw this in. Another diverse American city that is dominated by Democrats, that is Memphis, Tennessee, has a sky-high murder rate, and much of it is black people killing black people. We've been here before. If Joy Reid and the Divorcee Sam Seder and the vacuous AOC did a video every time a black person was murdered in Memphis by another black person, they would be really busy. More than 93% of the homicide offenders where the race of the offender was known in Memphis were black, and more than 86% of the victims were black. What was that about Jordan Neely again? Before I play some clips, I would tell the Divorcee Sam Seder, if he wants to do something to make America great again, tell those mostly young black males to raise the children they sire, and tell young women to keep their legs closed until they're married. 1, he will not do that because he is incapable of cultivating a decent relationship with a woman. I would presume that psychosis can be linked somehow to his relationship or lack thereof with his own father. So, he would be a hypocrite to use a line he has abused into oblivion. 2, he will not do that because intact nuclear families with parents that actually work are less likely to vote Democrat, and Sam Seder's best chance at creating more Democrat voters is to make sure more kids grow up without a father. Right, Stan?
There would have been no interest in this story whatsoever if it were a black-on-black act of violence on the subway. This story would not even have been a glimmer in the BLM universe. They would not have said a word. But the fact that there is a white guy involved here is what makes this a story. And sadly, you guys know this, the only reason George Floyd was a story to a large extent was because it was a white police officer. If it had been a black police officer doing that, it would have gotten a pinprick of the attention. And certainly if it were an act of violence that occurred between two black individuals, as has skyrocketed all over Minneapolis, nobody cares. The murder rate has doubled in Minneapolis since BLM started their protests. Nobody cares.
Has anyone seen a tweet from AOC or any of the other commies out there in the Democrat Party about the man yesterday in the Atlanta hospital who shot and murdered a woman, shot 4 other people? So a mass shooting in a hospital. Why is that so much less concerning to Democrats? Why is that such a lesser? We keep seeing this play out. We saw this with the young man who was shot at the door by the very elderly man who was frightened in what was it, Oklahoma, right?
Kansas City.
Kansas City. Thank you. And then the white girl in upstate, 20 years old in upstate New York, who was shot in the driveway. One of them gets tweets from the Biden White House. And the kid's fine, by the way. I mean, which is the right thing. It's a good thing.
The girl got murdered, and she got a fraction of the attention.
Nothing. No attention whatsoever. There's a 24-year-old black guy who shoots up a hospital yesterday, murders a woman, shoots 4 other people. What is AOC concerned with? The guy who is a clear maniac who had been arrested 40 times, who had been threatening and groping and attacking women in particular on the subway for years. He finally has somebody who steps in and says enough is enough. There's a physical confrontation. He dies. That's what the Democrat left is worried about right now. That's what they think we all need to be, as if that Marine is a threat to public safety. That Marine is the reason there is, in a lot of contexts, in a lot of ways, the man who stands up and says enough is enough, whether it's a law enforcement officer or an everyday citizen, that holds together public safety.
what did I say yesterday when our staff let us know, hey, there's an active shooter in Atlanta. They've just put out photos. They're looking for him. Pull it up. Black guy shoots 5 people in Atlanta. Story, I said, it's going to completely vanish.
Yep.
Because no one will care. If this were a Trump supporter running around in Atlanta shooting because he's angry about Trump being investigated or something like that, it would be the lead story for multiple days. But acts of violence are almost immediately reviewed in mainstream media, large media outlets, through the prism exclusively of race.
Welcome back. The left has resorted to glorifying the death of a thug in their quest to dismantle this country and devolve it into a race war. Jordan Neely, violent, multiple felon, 30-year-old homeless man who died after being placed in a chokehold by an ex-Marine on a New York subway, is the latest martyr. Radical progressives like AOC, Ayanna Pressley, raging in tweets that he was murdered and lynched. The mainstream media trying to portray Neely as a wonderful person who'd fallen on hard times and was murdered simply for being homeless. CNN's take: before Jordan Neely was killed on a New York City subway car this week, he was known for his swift Michael Jackson dance moves that entertained many. On MSNBC, Joy Reid claiming other subway riders who were harassed and threatened by Jordan Neely should be charged for not protecting their attacker from the ex-Marine who restrained him. Seriously, take a look.
How does this guy get away with doing a chokehold that police can't even do? And what about all those other people standing there watching him die? How is that not a crime? They didn't help him. There was no one else on the train. No one was at risk.
Just what you're missing on MSNBC. If you don't try to save the man who is threatening you, you belong in jail. If you want to know the real story here, we can pull up the rap sheet. In 2015, Neely was busted for attempted kidnapping after he was seen dragging a 7-year-old girl down a street, sentenced to only 4 months for that. In 2019, Neely was arrested for punching a 64-year-old man in the face. 2021, he randomly punched a 67-year-old woman in the face as she was walking out of the subway in Greenwich Village. That victim suffered a broken nose and a fractured skull. Jordan pleaded guilty to felony assault. Former New York mayoral candidate Curtis Sliwa and retired Rochester, New York Police Chief Laron Singletary both join me now. Gentlemen, it's good to see you. Curtis, there's no way to know what this man was capable of in this moment. Do you think there's going to be a charge and conviction here? How does this work?
Well, first off, you missed one. You had AOC, all out crazy, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez charged there was murder. Then they went a modern-day lynching. You missed the latest. Yes. It's an execution. They've gone for the trifecta. I don't care. Yeah. First off, this guy has been roaming the trains and has been a menace to society and to himself for years. He hasn't done a Michael Jackson imitation of moonwalk for 5 years. So this narrative just does not hold. And he has assaulted a wide variety of people. Now, you say to yourself, what was he doing in the subway? Why was he living down there? Aren't we responsible when you run a subway system like the state of New York to remove these people and bring them into a mental hospital, a psychiatric facility, which he should have been brought into? So now all of a sudden you have a Marine, active Marine, sitting on the train like everybody else, minding their business. He comes barging in, he's threatening, he's rambunctious. The Marine took preemptive action. He had the assistance of 2 other passengers. Unfortunately, this young man passed away. Now, all of a sudden, you want to vilify a hero who served our country overseas as a Marine, who turns out to be a surfer boy from Long Island.
Right. Laron, I want to get to you. We've seen what soft on crime policies have done to our big cities. We know why we're seeing more of this. The irony is they begged for community policing, and I think this is kind of what it looks like, because people are not going to stand by and live like this. People are not just going to be assaulted and screamed at on the subway.
You're right, Rob. Thanks for having me. You're absolutely right. You know, what happened 2 years ago was the defund the police movement that has continued on, and we're seeing the effects of it today. People are getting fed up. And when you defund the police, people will take actions into their own hands. And you have an individual who chose to intervene against another individual who, obviously, it's a very sad case. But context here is very important. And I'm glad you pointed out the fact that we have politicians who are just spouting off at the mouth.
Sure.
Governor Hochul, who said Jordan Neely was killed for just being a passenger on a subway train. That's not the case. And like you mentioned earlier, AOC said the same thing, calling the individual a murderer. You know, and Mayor Adams, I have, criticized him quite a bit, but to his credit, he has said come out and said, we have to wait for the facts. And as a police chief, that's what I just implore people to do. Wait for the facts to come out and let a grand jury decide.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick answer from both of you guys. Curtis, first, do you think charges at all come for this ex-Marine?
Nah, they'll put it before a grand jury. They'll exonerate him. But Black Lives Matter has become big, large mansions. They're not going to be taken to the streets.
Large mansions.
Police stations on fire, shop owners beaten in their own stores, the destruction of entire city blocks. To our media, to major corporations, to the Democratic Party itself, this is all defensible. It's heroic. It's the modern manifestation of the civil rights movement. Bob Woodson was actually a part of the civil rights movement, the original one. He's the founder of the Woodson Institute. He joins us now to assess what we're seeing on television. Mr. Woodson, thanks so much for coming on tonight. I'm just going to throw it to you. You've been watching.
Pleased to be here, Tucker.
Thank you. What do you make of this?
Well, Tucker, what you were saying about it really being a class, as a veteran of the civil rights movement, one of the great promises we gave to low-income blacks is that if you were to elect blacks to public office through Voting Rights Act, and we were running those institutions, that all of Black America would be better off. In the past 50 years, $22 trillion have been spent on poverty programs. 70% goes not to the poor, but those who serve poor people. So many of those people taking office use this money to create a class of people who are running these cities. And now, after 50 years of liberal Democrats running the inner cities, where we have all of these inequities that we have, race is being used as a ruse, as a means of deflecting attention away from critical questions such as why are poor blacks failing in systems run by their own people if race was an issue, even the criminal justice system. And if we continue to look at life through a racial prism, when evil wears a black face, it will escape detection and therefore correction.
But how damaging is it to our society for leaders to effectively incite racial division and hatred in order to cover their own failures? That seems like a very reckless thing to do.
It is worse. I mean, when you have low-income people in these people like in the Phillips section of Minneapolis, and these are ethnic neighborhoods, business centers that have been wiped out. People cannot get to the stores now, and they're crying out, and they're saying when everyone goes home and the cameras are gone and the civil rights grace-wreathing celebrities, you know, have done what they have done, low-income people are the ones who are suffering and they will continue to suffer. And that's why we must confront this and not allow race. We must deracialize race, and we must desegregate poverty. And that's what the Woodson Center is committed to do, working with the least of God's children to give them an opportunity to create solutions from the bottom up. But it is not race. I don't know what systemic racism is. Maybe someone can explain what that means.
It's a way to make people be quiet and stop asking questions about economics, as far as I can tell. So, but I just have to ask you, since you've been involved for 50 years, as you just said, and you were involved in the original civil rights movement, how does it feel to look back at the original goals of the movement and then to see people like Shaun King use the phrase civil rights activist in reference to himself? Is that bewildering to you?
It is bewildering and also painful, because I left the movement because I realized that many of the people who suffered most, poor blacks, did not benefit from the change, that their demographics was used by some of those leaders. It's more class than it is race. Yeah. And so they used it, and now race is being used to deflect attentions away from the failures of people running those institutions. The question is, why are black kids failing in school systems run by their own people? When Eric Holder was the U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., a lot of young people were shot by the police, but they were black police shooting black kids, and not one was prosecuted. But there was no public outcry, because as long as illegality or evil wears a black face, then it escapes detection. And that's what's wrong with looking through life through the prism of race.
Right. It doesn't make anybody better, that's for sure. Why do you think corporate America, so many of our biggest and most profitable companies, have jumped in so aggressively on the side of Black Lives Matter, for example?
You know, I really think it's white guilt, it's really a white guilt, and also it's an easy out. There are two people that I think are destroying this country, and that are guilty white people and angry, rich, entitled blacks who continue to play the race card, and they don't have to live with the consequences of their advocacy. When they're talking about the worst thing that can happen with police, right now, it's very ironic that as police nullification occur and they don't patrol in those communities, the murder rate goes up.
Of course.
And so actually, when these middle-class people who live in safe communities are villainize the police, but low-income people have to, the murder rate goes up. That same study you quoted from Harvard also documented the fact through police nullification results in less police, more black-on-black crime, more black-on-black deaths. Poor people are being hustled by these middle-class politicians. As Malcolm X said, they're being bamboozled, scammed, hoodwinked. And one day, that sleeping giant is going to wake up and understand who the real culprit is.
Yeah.
And it is people who look like them who are failing to use their positions to profit the least of God's children. Instead, they're using it to benefit themselves and their own group.
You're telling a very sad story.
Since Clay and Buck mentioned a mass shooting in Atlanta, I figured I would add their data to this essay quickly. Keep in mind, Atlanta is a city that is an uber-Democrat stronghold in a battleground state. From 2018 to 2020, Atlanta had a murder rate of 23.36 per 100,000, well beyond the national average. Their murder rate 2015 to 2017 was 19.97, also way above the national average. According to the FBI, in 2021, this is the Nibers data, of the 102 murder offenders where the race of the offender was known, 101 of them, or 99.01%, were black. 144 of the 155 murder victims, or 92.9%, were also black. So it's not a red herring to bring up black-on-black homicide. In Atlanta, I can't remember, it's not even half, or I can't remember the demographics. It's plurality black, I think. Go look it up yourself. But there's a whole lot of black people being slain in Atlanta on a regular basis. A lot of them young, their lives cut short by the overweight Joy Reid, the bartender AOC, and the divorcee Sam Seder somehow missed it.